Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. We are so happy to have you here. Welcome. We will get started now. My name is Cheyenne Sapp. I recently joined the team at Nonprofit Vote as Campaign Director of National Voter Registration Day. I'm so excited to meet you all individually and grow our partnership in the coming year. So today we are going to be discussing the top 10 tactics that nonprofits can employ to get out the vote. We know that many of you do this work and do it very well, so this will serve as a refresher and a reminder of the broad spectrum of things that you can do. We are joined by a great panel today that will talk about some of their tactics for outreach, and we're so excited to hear from them. So without further ado, let's get started. Some quick housekeeping items that we want to address. We want to put on your radar again that this webinar is being recorded and it will be shared with you at a later date. We also want to remind you of some news from our partners over at Vote Early Day. That Vote Early Day is actually happening tomorrow, so October 26th. It's a great opportunity to remind community members that they have a chance to vote without being in person. So if they're traveling or just can't make it to the polls on election day, this is a great opportunity to encourage them to still cast their vote and be a part of the civic holiday. So thanks to our friends at Vote Early Day for leading the charge on that. And lastly, we have an open role as we are expanding our team here at Nonprofit Vote. We have a new position for Education and Partnerships Coordinator. That team member will be tasked with building upon the tools and resources that we offer here to help community partners like you to be successful in this work. So that includes our webinars, our trainings, our fact sheets, etc. So if you know anyone who might be a good fit, please encourage them to apply for the position on our website and at nonprofitvote.org, and we'd love to have them. So let's set the stage a bit. We're at 2:06 now, and let's set the stage for what this webinar is about. So the topic came about because we know that get out the vote tactics cover a broad spectrum. And we've heard from community partners that they often feel as though they don't have adequate resources and capabilities to do a full rollout of a complete GOTV plan. And often they kind of feel dissuaded because of that from participating in any GOTV tactics at all. So the purpose of this webinar is to remind everyone that there are both high and low engagement tactics that you can use no matter what resources you have available or where you are. A lot of these reminders will be things that you already know, since a lot of you, again, have been doing the work, but it's meant to serve just as refreshers. With that, we've invited some of our partners to speak on what types of GOTV tactics they do, their best practices, and most importantly, some of their key learnings from the field. We'll also have a Q&A at the end of the panel, but feel free to drop in any questions that you may have during this discussion, and we will be answering them in the chat, but we can also chat about them after the panel. And once again, just a reminder that this webinar is being recorded and will be shared with you at a later date. Thank you again to our panelists for being here. We're so excited to see you. So we'll get started with the top 10 GOTV tactics. We'll get into the panel discussion and then that Q&A. So some quick info to set the stage a bit on getting out the vote. We know that obviously this work takes a lot of effort. And we know that GOTV messaging can sometimes be very generic. So one of the key tactics that we want you to remember and take away from this with is that you want to make this information that you're disseminating as personal as possible, because generic messaging simply just doesn't do as well. Additionally, GOTV messages should have a level of positive social pressure. Social pressure can sometimes be misunderstood, so we want to make sure that this is positive social pressure to not only register to vote, but to go out and vote on election day. We want to do that by helping voters make a plan, reminding them, of course, of the dates and deadlines, and providing them with the important information that's going to impact their turnout, especially when it comes to local elections. We know also that there's a strong association between a voter's level of political activism, and the amount of campaign reach that they are receiving. So those touch points are extremely important. So these are all things that we know already, right? To make sure that we can build and implement some really great GOTV work. So in terms of these top 10s, let's start with number one. Number one is, of course, you have to build a plan. And in order to have a strong plan, you have to hit the ground running with the basics. So a solid GOTV plan must start with a purpose. Why are you doing this work beyond reminding voters of why it's important to get out the vote? That is something that, you have been working on. It's a strategy that you've shaped throughout the year and your other voter engagement work. And it's something that you already know, but it's important to have a purpose for the day that will lead and start with why across your messaging. Also designate a date. So this could be a rolling date if you have adequate resources to be able to do so. For some organizations, you may just designate one particular date that you do all of your GOTV outreach on. Either is fine, but have a target date in mind. You want this work and this plan to be easy and personal. So we want this simplified language to roll out to community members so they are remembering the key points and why this is important. We also, again, want to stay away from that generic messaging. So do your best to make it as personal as possible. You want to be inclusive, of course, of the communities that you serve and their needs, and you want this plan to be relevant. So if you live in a community that you know well, make the plan as tailored as possible to their needs and speak to them in ways that they're used to be spoken to. And then lastly, make sure you hit the big points. So again, we want to make sure that this messaging in this plan is succinct and memorable so that voters have key takeaways to get out the vote on the day. And for number two, assess your strengths and define your target areas. So in order to ensure that these resources that you have are being appropriately allocated, knowing what your strengths are will be extremely important. You want to be able to leverage those strengths and those resources to identify where to even start your canvassing. So if you're doing door-to-door, if you're doing phone calls, or if you're even just doing email engagement, know what your strengths are there and consider that. You might want to consider with your canvassing specific communities, maybe communities that have low voter turnout, maybe some that have experiencing redistricting or rezoning since the last election, or one that has a high population of disenfranchised voters. These are just some examples of where you can do your canvassing, but most importantly, know what strengths you have. And number three, ready your outreach team with Circle. So we love to use this idea of how to prepare yourself for this GOTV. A successful plan always starts with a prepared team. So your team is getting not only all of the details from you on GOTV and voter engagement, but they're also being inspired by you in addition to being educated. So your team should go out with a sense of confidence and being able to speak one-to-one with voters in this GOTV outreach. They should be comfortable handling challenging conversations while still staying nonpartisan. And they should also have very easy access to important tools and resources. So an easy way to remember this is communication, inspiration, resources, collaboration, leadership, and engagement. Number four, prep your tools and scripts. Tools and scripts are going to be essential in empowering your team and making sure that they feel ready to do this work. So examples of those tools and scripts include those one-pagers that many of you already have. Nonprofit Vote has a ton at our disposal, so we're happy to share those with you. There's voter guides as well as information on general information on statewide voter laws. And then talking points are really valuable, especially to team members who are just volunteers. They want to feel comfortable, they want to feel confident in navigating conversations, whether it be difficult conversations or easy ones. So you can definitely do your part in preparing them for that. And another example of that preparation could be FAQs. So, if your volunteers are going out and speaking to disenfranchised voters, make sure that they have the right talking points to be able to speak adequately to these voters. Number 5, provide a voter's guide. So in local and quote unquote off elections, although we know there's never an off election year, voters need to feel that extra confidence in knowing exactly who's going to be on the ballot as well as what positions. So voter guides really help to mitigate the surprise of showing up at the voting booth. Also allow voters time to familiarize themselves with the candidates and the positions in advance. Remember, this work is nonpartisan, so include all of the candidates and all of the positions, regardless of political affiliation. And what's great about voter guides here is that there's no need to invent the wheel or to create a new guide. All of these guides already exist. So you can see them at like vote111.org, vote411.org, Ballotopedia, Ballot Ready, Guides.vote, and many others. There's also local election offices that have voter guides available, and you should use the one that is most important and most relevant to your community. Number 6, provide information about how to vote. So voting on election day can be extremely confusing, especially for voters who vote inconsistently and for newly registered voters. So we know that there's voters who only turn out in presidential elections and completely ignore their local elections. And then there's voters who have never been to a poll site before. So you can help these voters feel ready to cast their ballots by providing a sample ballot, which is really just going to give them a visual example of what they can expect to see, or something like a one-pager or instructional video that includes a step-by-step summary of how to cast their electronic or even paper ballots. Number 7, provide resources to help voters overcome barriers at the polls. So you want to help voters feel prepared by providing them with these important resources. And once again, we're not reinventing the wheel here. All of these resources already exist. So it's our job as community partners to bring all of those resources together in very easy to understand and comprehensive formats. So an example of this includes like election protection, which is 866 Our Vote. You can also provide them with voter ID requirements by state. Vote Riders provides that. Again, there's Ballot Ready, Ballotopedia, and then you can also refer them to state-specific websites for the Secretary of State, where those house a lot of voter registration and voter outreach information. Number 8, so this is one that's very popular and one we know very well, door-to-door and phone/text canvassing. One thing that we know for sure is that door-to-door canvassing has been proven to be the most effective tactic. Now, does every nonprofit have the capability to go do door-to-door, especially this late in the game? Maybe, maybe not. It doesn't have to be the end-all be-all, but if you are doing door-to-door canvassing, here are some things to remember. A nonpartisan script for both door-to-door or phone or text canvassing is really important because, again, it's going to make your volunteers feel prepared with talking points and navigating those difficult conversations. Your door-to-door volunteers should also know the areas that they are canvassing. This is extremely important because, again, it's going to make them feel ready and more comfortable in the area that they'll be navigating. And lastly, an understanding of canvassing rules or a refresher is really important to know the campaign literature and the canvassing process. Also report the possibility that they'll need to report back. And if they don't need to report back, just a clear understanding of what the expectations are after canvassing. And another example of popular GOTV tactic is posting to social media. We would consider this to be a little bit more low engagement because it's an easy thing that you can do today. You can kind of schedule a few social media posts to go up between now and election day. So this is one that you don't need, it doesn't take a big lift, but it's also a really effective tool if that is what you have at your disposal. So you can use social media in a myriad of ways, but one of the examples is reposting other GOTV content. So all of the content doesn't have to be organic and come directly from you, or original rather. You can use social media to do reposts. Feel free to repost Nonprofit Votes posts, but your social media posts, if they are original, should include shortened links to resources. So for example, you can use Bitly, incorporate easy to view graphics or memes. So make it fun, but also going back to our first point, make it relevant. And make sure that it's not too generic. You can also take into consideration the platform here. So if you're posting to Instagram, you do want to lean into more visual examples. For TikTok, you want to lean into videos. For Facebook, you might be able to just get away with some literature or like a text heavy post, but you want to take into consideration what you're posting and who's viewing it. Also, make sure your posts are accessible by providing these image descriptions, and make sure again that it resonates with voters. You have been engaging with these voters, you know them well, so make sure that it is as relevant as possible and speaks directly to them. And number 10, to round out the list, is plan to send out last minute emails. So this is another low engagement option. Emails are super low lift and a great way to engage voters. You can do a mail merge and send out a bunch of emails, even starting today, leading through election day. But you should make sure the following: include a prominent subject line, because community partners, we send out a ton of emails already. So voters are already used to receiving many emails. So let's try to make it as enticing as possible. Today is election day. Here's what you need to know to go vote. That is a great example of how to make it catchy, but then also something that's going to grab their attention and remind them that this day is here. You want to make sure within the body of the email to be succinct and be impactful. Remind voters why this matters, especially if it's a local election season. And then lastly, highlight the most important info that voters should know, such as your poll site locator, resources for overcoming barriers, and how to vote. So that rounds out the top 10 GOTV tactics. Again, this is meant to be a reminder and a refresher, since you guys do this work and do it extremely well. And we wanted to just kind of remind you that there's a broad spectrum of ways that you can do this GOTV work, whether you have a lot of resources at your disposal or maybe just a few between now and election day. So we're going to hear now from our panelists, who are absolutely fantastic. They do this work and they are going to share with us how they go about doing this work, some of their best practices, as well as some of their key learnings. So I'd like to invite my panelists to please come on screen. There you are. Thank you guys so much for joining us once again and being a part of this very important dialogue and discussion. So a brief intro to you guys. We have now Caroline Mack, who is the Evaluation and Learning Manager here at Nonprofit Vote. We have Benjamin Ripley, who is the Voter Engagement Manager at Baker Ripley. And we have Curdy Carno, who is the Advocacy and Associate Director at the Disability Network. So once again, thank you all for being part of this important discussion about GOTV. This is also super important because many nonprofits are gearing up for the general election this year, but then also readying their voter engagement plans for the big election that we have coming up next year. So thank you guys. So the first question I'd like to address to all three of you, Katie, Ben, and Caroline. GOTV tactics cover a broad spectrum, but what would you say of the top 10 that we share or of your own are the most effective strategies, and explain what makes these strategies effective? And I guess we will start with Caroline, if that's okay.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing all those tactics. Definitely some really good ones in there. maybe I'll say like part of two. So definitely, I think it was your second one, just looking at your assets, looking at your target audience. Definitely, you might not think you have assets, but if you have staff on hand who do translations, if you've got a relationship with a local printer, if you just know where the local events or different service distributions happen, those are all assets. Those are all knowledge of where people are going to be. And that's definitely all opportunities that other people might not know about in terms of GeoTV opportunities. So those are all great. The other one, I'll just say that we do in our field programs where we do a lot of like peer-to-peer texting. So anything where, if you have the technical capabilities, but there's also platforms out there that can make it really easy and plug and play. Basically, there are ways that you as an organization can set up an account, text voters on a list. They're now MMS, so you can text like a picture even, so it's a really engaging way to, really just connect with the people in your community, say, hey, does anyone need help? Do you need to know where you need to vote? And you can just reply directly in those messages, kind of like you would email. So again, nice touch point. And you can kind of customize it like, hey, this is the YMCA of Greater Darby telling you to go vote. And so, it's also a nice way to be like, hey, we're not spam. We're not one of those candidates trying to reach out to you. So it's a nice way to get above the fold, and it's really cheap. So that's definitely one that we use pretty frequently.
Awesome. I'll pass it to Benjamin.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. This is a really great list. And at Baker Ripley, we try to do at least versions of most of the things that we talked about today. Recently, we've been putting more emphasis on putting together voter guide and voter guide information for our target audiences. We identified here in Houston, the League of Women Voters does a really good job covering a lot of races. And so part of what we do is partnering with them to distribute their voter guide materials more broadly to our audiences. We make sure that we have them at our community centers. We bring them with us on block walks and when we do in-person canvassing. And so when we encounter somebody at the door who wants more information, it's easy to have something at the ready and say like, hey, this is a really great resource. But we identified in the past year some elections and races that the League of Women Voters wasn't covering. And so we actually decided to step up and contact the candidates and put together our own voter guide materials in some of those races to supplement some of those things where there were gaps so that we could be responsive to our community, which one of the most common things we get is I don't have enough information about the candidates, or how do I make a choice? And being able to provide that information either by directing them to a resource or being able to provide the resource has been really important for us, and I think very successful. And I know Caroline's already said this, but that assessing your strengths in your target areas is really critical. And when I think about which of our efforts have been successful and not, I think that a lot of times are the people we're contacting, have they heard of us? Are they familiar with us? I think that like cold calls or text messages to people who are not familiar with who we are or don't know where we're coming from are some of our least effective outreach. But when we're contacting people who have interacted with us in some way or form, have either received a service from us or live close to our community center and can remember seeing it as they're driving past it. Any kind of familiarity with your organization helps so much when you're trying to make these often persuasive messages, because we're talking to people who don't vote very often for us. And so having that familiarity and the comfort of like, we're a community member, we're a partner, we're a trusted organization. And we really do focus most of our conversations on that information on how to vote, that providing information and focusing really on the process. And in Texas, there's a few extra hurdles sometimes. We have to be registered 30 days in ahead of elections. There's specific times and some other constraints and laws and things. So we really do try to provide most of our focus when we're having a conversation with somebody on the how and not the what necessarily.
And Katie.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you very much for having me today. I'll build a little bit on what Benjamin was just saying. So I like things that empower and inform. So I think it was number 6, the how to vote is huge. And so there's been some really momentous changes in voting accessibility and even voting by mail. I'm in Michigan, so there's been some changes really since the election in 2020 and how people could vote remotely and accessibly, and that's still evolving. So staying up to date and really helping people know what changes are happening, what new opportunities there are. And we have really kind of explored more with the voter assist terminals. So really getting the information out about those videos, working with the state. We've partnered with other organizations who brought in a voter assist terminal for people to use and try out and get comfortable with. So really focusing on knowing how you're going to vote, knowing your right to vote, and then some of those like day of expectations, talking about different barriers and who your allies are and what some of those procedures might be if you were to encounter something. But again, people feel empowered and informed.
Love that. Thank you guys for sharing those tactics. Those strategies are really great and definitely could be applied across any GOTV plan at any level. So thank you. And my next question for you is, so we know that GOTV plans must be inclusive of the groups that they reach, and they should also include educational resources that speak to specific populations. Again, going back to the point that we have to make this work as relevant as possible. So for Katie and Ben, how would you design a voter engagement plan that is universal and all-encompassing? What are the components that you believe should be included? And I'll start with Katie.
Thank you for that question. So I think one of the things is when we're coming up with plans, sometimes it can be easy to generalize, but even just understanding the nuance of the people we're working with and taking their lead on some of these things. So we do try to meet people where they are, being accessible, and then staying tied in with partners and leaders who can keep us up to date, keeping some of our internal accessibility standards and acumen up to date as well. But there's some really great resources if people are looking for additional resources and accessibility. That's going to be core on all of ours, in communication, in language style, on the web. All of these pieces are kind of fundamental to how we're reaching people. And again, partnership is going to be key for us, the size of our organization and where we're situated and who some of our amazing partners are. That will always be part of our get out the vote and voter strategy.
I think of a lot of things when I think about this question. When it comes down to making the plan, there really isn't a single universal contact strategy or message that's going to work for your entire audience ever. And so I think that part of it comes down to really trying to break down who all of the different groups of people are, younger voters, older voters. We have a lot of Hispanic and Latinx voters that we are working to reach, and really trying to customize our contact plans for each of them, tailoring our messaging, tailoring which languages and which scripts that we use. And sometimes we don't know exactly which contact strategy is going to work the best. And so being willing to try different things, being willing to, send out a mailer, try texting, try phone banking. Different people are going to respond to different ways that you can contact them with information. And so I think one of my best advice is just to try multiple strategies. Holding events can be a great way to bring people together. Katie mentioned partnerships. Partnerships are super important for us, and they're a great way to reach people. And And so, yeah, I think it's a big part is just not putting all of your eggs in one basket, so to speak, and try to be broad with your contact strategies and think about all of the different potential ways that you and your organization can engage with the people that you're hoping to reach. And thinking about things like language access, thinking about things like technology can be a barrier, especially for older voters, folks with limited internet access. And so leaning too heavily on an internet resource or a technology tool can be a turnoff to some voters as well.
Yeah, I'm so glad you guys mentioned that, because it really is important that you take a holistic approach to take all of those considerations into your plan. So my next question is actually for Caroline. As organizations build their voter engagement plans, many may feel just ill-equipped to do GOTV since they have limited staff, limited resources. So what would you say is the biggest misconception about GOTV, and what would you suggest organizations do to maximize their effectiveness with the resources that they do have available?
Yeah, that's a great one. And if anyone in the audience also sees misconceptions they hear about GOTV, definitely pop them in the chat too. This is based on my personal experience working with our groups. But what I've seen is people often give pause just to the word GOTV. What does that stand for? Like, whoa, what is that? And once they do, I think the first image that comes to mind are, campaigns doing door knocking on a large scale, mail drops, big phone banks, calls, text mobilization, handwritten postcards, rides to the polls. Those are all fantastic. But they also do take money, time, planning. We've got like maybe a week and a half to go. Would not recommend trying to start one of these things right now. So and there's also the idea that it's better left to the political people campaigns to do GOTV. But in fact, we do see that for low propensity voters, things that are low pressure, nonpartisan are very effective at getting people who are just starting out in their voting journey. So really, one thing that's a pretty big kind of conception about GOTV that we can challenge as nonprofits, doing voter engagement. And so one of the things that we can do is we can start much smaller scale, targeting, really doing that targeting to be effective, and ultimately thinking of GOTV as anything that puts voting top of mind, even for your staff, just like, hey, just maybe go vote. That can be, a quick email, that can be the quick social post. If that's all you have time for, that's totally fine. But maybe you have an email list, 26 people, for your Habitat for Humanity, and these are the residents that you talk to and that you like manage your roster of. That's great. That's perfect. In fact, that might even get above the noise more than a text from a random stranger that they don't remember signing up for a list for. I know I get a lot of those. So and also just focusing kind of in that example, focusing on the people you already reach out to. So if you do citizenship assistance, great, you're going to have a lot of first-time voters. Talk to them about what it's like to go through that process. They're not going to know because they've never done that before. That might just be 5 people. That might just be 10 people. That's totally fine. And like in the future, maybe you can increase that. We have stories from our groups of people that just walk, this elderly person to the county election office because they didn't know where it was and they've never been before. And that was their first time voting because no one ever told them that their voice mattered. And so you can have a huge impact, if anything, if you just kind of target that. And also, Katie, we work with some disability groups where the polling place moved and they're like, oh my gosh, like I don't know if it's going to have an accessible entrance. You're doing small things like, hey, offering to, you want to go visit it beforehand, we can take your parents with you, just like look at the ramp, check the machine, check the building, just be more familiar. Those all make such a huge difference. So GOTV can have high impact, but on like personal relational scales. I did see a question in the chat that we can come back to about where do we find out how to reach low income or low turnout areas. And so definitely one way to also target is go to mapping and just like see in your neighborhood, where are the typically lower income, typically have lower turnout. People of color, high populations, also lower turnout. So we can come back to that question, but just want to lift that up.
Great answer, Caroline. Thank you so much. And what is so important from that is you raise that, you know, a lot of times with GOTV, we kind of get overly ambitious and we bite off way more than we can chew. So, you know, keep it simple. We have done this work all across the year, and this is not necessarily the day that you have to try to reach everybody within the community, but let's go back to the one that we know that we can reach, and we can figure out how to make one, that messaging super relevant, but then also we can figure out what are the best ways that they need help being reached. And we can think about it kind of like biting it a little by little instead of taking like a huge gulp. So thank you for that. And for our last question, and thank you for flagging, we have some really great questions coming in through the chat. So please keep your questions coming. After this last question, we are going to go into the Q&A. So we are going to address some of those questions that you've asked. So thank you. And so for our last question, we'd like to hear from all three of you on this one. What are your recommendations for overcoming general GOTV issues? These could be day of issues. This could be issues that you encounter out in the field. This could be issues, you know, the day before. Give us an example of an issue that you've encountered in your efforts and explain how you overcame that. And what piece of advice would you give to other community partners who might be in similar scenarios? And I will throw it to Benjamin.
Thanks. Great question. We've encountered tons of issues over over GOTVs. I can think of several. You know, one example, one of our texting platforms went down that we were relying on to send messages to. How did we overcome it? We actually, one of our partner organizations allowed us to use access through one of their platforms to send some messages in the interim while we had the outage that lasted a couple of weeks during one of ours. So it wasn't a great situation. And we've had other issues as well. And I think that my recommendation for all of them is, you know, keep your organization's mission in mind. You know, think about what your purpose and what your mission is and who you're trying to reach. And I also think that even if you're a small organization, even if you're doing it for the first time, learning to take ownership for as many of the tools that you use as possible is good. And that could mean learning how to use like Action Network or Van, learning how to administer the text platforms yourself or the phone banking tools, because that gives you the most flexibility and it allows you to solve problems more quickly when they arise if they're more administered by yourself than by somebody else. And so that would be my recommendation.
Awesome. Katie.
Is it okay if I do two?
Absolutely.
Okay, so number one, let's go with just internal capacity. You know, we're a Center for Independent Living and we do a lot of different things. And so it might not be that like voting is something we can always get to. And even over the last 20 years, it has looked differently how we've done it. But some things that have really, really worked well for us is that partnership piece and building coalition. And so some years where we could do more, we could bring other people in, and then years where they could do more, we could help bolster that and kind of bringing our audiences together, the people we work with together. So even sometimes when it feels like we don't have enough time, enough resources, enough people, us nonprofits are really good at building coalition and just finding out who can help with the lift when we're all kind of trying to move in the same direction. And then the other piece in Michigan last year, we had an external thing that we just needed to navigate quickly, which was a misinformation campaign about changes in dates of voting for various reasons. People in Flint and Detroit were getting text messages saying that the voting date had changed. So the things that we did was keeping messages positive, keeping them only focused on the facts, and just, you know, when we were doing in-person visits, just talking about that, if people did get the text, like, nope, here's the information, here's the, you know, we have cards, like, this is it, like, we're good, just, you know, show up to your polling place. And so I think some of those external things that we couldn't plan for, even, you know, the best messaging in the world, and you get something like that the week before an election. So again, just staying positive, being consistent was really key to that.
Thank you. And Caroline.
Yeah, Katie, I love that. I And also, wow, that is a disinformation tactic I've not heard of yet. So today I learned. Um, I would say one of the issues is that there's so many recommendations out there, like use social pressure. How about party the polls? Do calls to text. There's kind of a little bit of a generic like playbook, but I would say like keep your gut feelings close. If your community, if you know your elderly community doesn't feel safe going outside and waiting in line, maybe don't do a party at the polls. If you are getting, if you serve a rural community and you think they're going to have privacy concerns, maybe don't use social pressure messaging that says, yeah, we know what your voting record is, please vote. That might backlash, and that definitely has happened. So you know more your community, and it takes a lot of resources, a lot of money, a lot of time to test GeoTV tactics. And so a lot of the things that, like, just because it's been tested doesn't mean it's the best for you. So there's still things that you're going to have to do to think about, is this going to work for us? Not just capacity, not just targeting, but like, we've heard groups where they do calls and their people are like, yeah, just because you called, we're not voting. It's a different world sometimes, and it's easy to stay disconnected to it. So really just like trial and error. That's also why, starting small is really good. See if it works for you, and then, if not, pivot. Just because it was tested doesn't mean it's the best fit and strategy for your guys' people. So that's what
Maintain flexibility. That is fantastic, Caroline. Thank you. And that is so important because this work is ever changing. So be flexible, be adaptable, but then also keep it relevant. So thank you guys so much. This was a fantastic panel. Thank you. And thank you for making the time to join us. We are going to switch gears now and open up for some of those audience questions. So to our audience members, if you have any questions that you'd like to drop into the chat, now's your chance. But we do have a few already that Travis has raised for us. So let's address some of those. So the first question is the one that you called out, Caroline. You mentioned that how do we know which areas have low voter turnout or a large number of disenfranchised voters? That's a question that came from Molly, and that was a question that you started to address. So if you could build on that, that'd be wonderful.
Yeah. So it is hard to find good sources of data that are not really expensive. So I mentioned Policy Map, and it's a mapping software that's free. And I mentioned kind of there is a correlation of lower income folks and people of color that have lower turnout. This is just a thing in the census. So Policy Map won't give you, turnout by county, but it will give you, here's the higher percentage of Asians, African Americans, Hispanic voters, or low income voters, or renters even. It's a really neat software. You can just kind of go online and check it out. It's free to use. So I will put it in, I don't know actually if I can put it in the chat, but I will put it into the host chat, and maybe someone can throw that out there. The other one is L2 Data. You can sign up for an account with them, but they're, again, another mapping software. And we did do a mapping webinar maybe last year on just like how to use these things and demoing it. But L2 Data does have more of that voter turnout data, and it might be more granular. But again, turnout data is just hard to get if you're not connected to like a VAN or state table, state voices. So I definitely did recommend just maybe like doing some proxies. We do find that typically like, lower income areas do have lower turnout. So whatever ways that you kind of can find a different indicator of that is good.
Awesome. Thank you, Caroline. I have a question for Ben, and then I have a question specifically for Katie. So a question on messaging, Ben. What do you think is more effective, message content or who is delivering the message during this time when different disinformation, which we talked about, is everywhere? This is a question from Angie.
That's a terrific question. And I think you get different answers from different people on this one. I think both are important. That's a little bit of a cop-out. But I do think that who it comes from, I think, would lean a little bit more important. Like, I think like the content is really important, but whether they are going to take that content as being reliable or trustworthy depends very heavily on who it comes from. And so I do think that the sender of the content is more important.
And then a question for Katie. So from Anonymous, how do we reach people with disabilities when most are not associated with any given specific agency or organization that might be connected to their particular disability?
That is an interesting question. So I want to start with information we know about people with disabilities. We're typically underrepresented, and even in like census, we are not represented because of disclosing personal information. There might be distrust to share that information. So we're kind of an interesting group. So I do think there are a number of organizations that people with disabilities are engaging with, depending on your state, depending on your community. There are centers for independent living across the United States. We are organizations run by people with disabilities for people with disabilities. We self-identify, we do peer support, and we work with other organizations to connect to other communities who maybe aren't as connected to ours. So I would start in that space there, seeing what's available. It's quite possible based on the question you have, and maybe I'd love to know more specifically about the question of who it is you want to reach. And so that's something that I would love to know more about if you want to ask more. But I think there's lots of opportunities to engage with people with disabilities at different points in life. I think just knowing a little bit more about the goal and who it is we're talking about. But I will acknowledge it's a little nebulous, I guess, that, it's hard.
Hard to answer it, but we will definitely connect you in the chat.
Thank you.
So I think we have time for a couple of more questions. So I want to raise this one. This is from Becky. So she said, in Mississippi, we're trying to raise awareness that based on the sheer number of registered African-American voters in Mississippi, increasing African-American turnout on election day gives them the power to determine who holds state offices, which is very important. So she asked, if you were going to come up with an effective message to convey this and the importance of this and all of the issues that are impacting them as voters, what are the, maybe not specifically, but what are the components of that messaging that you would use to build this this kind of strategy? And I guess we can throw that to all three of you. Maybe just a quick thought that comes to mind on what component you would make sure to be included in that messaging. And we'll start with Caroline.
Yeah, this is a good one, Becky. This is something that you can also feel free to reach out to Nonprofit Vote Team. But I would say the first thing that comes to mind is, if we as, assuming you're part of that population, if we don't raise our voice, who will? Like, we know the problems that affect our community, like our voice deserves to be heard, and that these resources deserve to be allocated to our community. The only way that's going to happen is if we make sure that our voices show up at home. So just, it's us, like it is kind of up to us to do that. And kind of the collective power angle is something that we hear with groups that reach out to immigrant or ethnicities of like, it's about our collective voice. Sometimes the like your vote matters doesn't quite resonate as much, but it's more about, our voice deserves to be heard, and it hasn't been heard enough in the past. That's kind of what comes to mind.
Absolutely. Katie, what are your thoughts?
I will say the same thing, the power of a group coming together. I guess that's something too with disability, is when a block comes forward, the more you can build that coalition. I feel like all I keep saying is like partnership and building things, and that also can be quite difficult. But I do feel like there's more power the more people we can get aligned, as difficult as that can be. I'm located in Flint, Michigan, and so sometimes it's hard to feel like we're all going in the same direction. So,
yep, you know it well. And Ben, what are your thoughts?
I think that what Caroline and Katie said were great. I think that people want to feel like they're part of something bigger, and so framing it as like an opportunity to be a part and to come together and be a part of a change is great. And I do also think that making the argument that, if you deciding to sit this one out means that somebody else is deciding for you. And I think a lot of people don't like that. But I definitely agree with what Katie and Caroline said too.
And I think this is a good way to segue into what community partners really are looking for with this work. A lot of it is challenging. We're going into a very tough election cycle where folks are more willing to come out to vote, but they are kind of pushing back and kind of feeling like their votes are not being represented. So how about we go around and we just give one piece of inspiration. And it could be something as straightforward as go team go, but what inspiration would you share with these community groups to do this work and remind them of how important it is, especially in the face of what they will likely encounter with this election and then coming up in the year? And I'll start with Caroline.
Say that sometimes GeoTV is hard because it's like door knocking. You're gonna get the dude who is like, why are you at my door? You're gonna get the call that's like, I just hang up on. But sometimes you do get those calls where it's like, wow, like thanks so much for calling me, thanks so much for reminding. Or maybe they don't respond, but that is how they feel. And I think this kind of comes back to the targeting, as long as you're reaching out to the group of people that need to be involved, like just keep trying and trying different things. And a lot of new technologies coming out, ways to personalize your organization's name onto stuff, ways to put images out. There's so many other strategies we haven't tried yet. So yeah, just there's so many ways to do it. Maybe there's one that you haven't discovered yet. So
Ben, what do you think?
We believe a lot in like an appreciative model, and so we're always looking at focusing on what works. There's going to be plenty of things that don't work, when you do your GeoTV thing. But I think focusing on what's working with your organization and how can you build on successes. And one thing that's an advantage for nonprofits is that hopefully you can do this repeatedly. You can do this over multiple cycles and contact people over time. And so I think also it's easy in GeoTV to be like laser focused on just right now, but just remembering that it's a bigger part. It's part of what the rest of your work as a nonprofit, and that the work that you do now is going to build in future years as well.
Absolutely. Katie, last but not least.
Celebrate every win. Sometimes it feels like it's this big giant wall that we have to break down or build up. I don't know, I'm losing my metaphor here, but just chipping away, and every time just celebrating every small win, every voter registration, every time someone even told you that they weren't going to vote and here's why, but maybe they came back the next week and asked a question. They saw you as someone they could trust. Who knows what that conversation will lead to down the line. So I feel like all of those things, like I'm almost too optimistic. I'm like, yes, like they took a pen, they'll come back for more. So I think just, again, being engaged in your community is another amazing way to be engaged in the community about something so vital. So every small win.
Awesome. And thank you guys. This has been so inspiring. So I'm taking from Katie, celebrate every win, no matter how big or small. From Ben, focus on what's working, and more importantly, focus on the bigger picture. And then from Caroline, keep trying, stay on your toes, and stay adaptable. So with that, thank you guys so much for being a part of this and inspiring our community partners to go out and do this GeoTV work. We'll conclude the webinar here. Thank you to everyone for joining. If we don't see you again this year, happy holidays, get some rest. We have a big election year upon us for next year, and we're gearing up. Have a wonderful election day this year, and we will see you again in January. Continue this work and take charge. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us at Nonprofit Vote. And with that, bye all. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.